Hi, and welcome to the second lecture on globalization. We're going to pick up with the way that globalization has changed the way people move around the world. One kind of obvious thing, and maybe most accessible to a lot of us, is the spread of international tourism and the spread of study abroad. A lot of people do these now. These have been really facilitated or helped along by the increase in transcontinental airplane lines and the increasing cheapness, well, depending on fuel costs, of those trips. But this is kind of a double-edged sword because sometimes this aspect of globalization that people move around the world and interact with each other is, helps create ties between people that are very, caring and meaningful. But on the other hand, if you think about, say, a lot of the people behind the 9/11 attacks, many of them had actually studied in the U.S., and so it was actually exposure to American culture, which kind of helped to make them, more angry at or more against the U.S. The end of the Cold War has also had a big effect on the spread of tourism and study abroad because people who grew up in, say, Russia previously wouldn't have been able to study very much in the U.S. And vice versa. But now those kind of walls have fallen down. I remember my old Russian professor when she grew up during the Cold War, and when she studied in Russia, she had these KGB agents like following her around, and she had to do a lot of weird stuff to get away from them. Ask me if you ever have any questions about that. Immigration is also a kind of more permanent way that people move around the world, both legally and illegally. Immigration, it fluctuates. It goes in waves based on economic patterns. For instance, after the recession that began in 2008 in the U.S., immigration in a lot of ways decrease because there was less economic pull that the U.S. was exerting on other countries. But at the same time, there's always going to be some economic or cultural spots that draw people in, and with the increased ease and the increased interaction between places, more people are taking advantage of these opportunities. For instance, my great 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 grandparents who immigrated from Scotland over to the U.S., they figured, all right, once we come over on the boat, we're not going to be seeing the people we're closest to in Scotland anymore for the rest of our lives. But now that's obviously with the internet, with the cell phone, that's no longer an issue. So immigration seems like it's in some ways less permanent, and thus making it in a lot of ways more, more attractive. Refugees are kind of forced migrants. That's the people who are running away from zones where there's wars or maybe famine or economic upheaval. What you see in front of you is Kurds, ethnic Kurds in Iraq during the first Gulf War, trying to get away from war areas. And these days in Syria and Iraq, due to the rise of ISIS, in the Congo region, due to kind of a lot of different low-level and some high-level warfare going on there, people are fleeing from conflict. So this has definitely added to the globalization of human population. Human trafficking also is a very serious problem, and that's when people are moved around largely for economic reasons. You have actual human slavery of the type you think of in 150 years ago that's actually still going on, especially in places where there's not very much rule of law, like some areas in the Middle East still have slavery. Kind of the very backwoods areas of Brazil, that's still essentially some people are forced into working and unable to not. In terms of the trafficking largely of women for sexual slavery is, a massive problem still. It goes on in the U.S., it goes on really throughout the world. So this is another kind of bad aspect of globalization in terms of the movement of people. In terms of businesses, global trade has been increasing very much over the last several decades, again with some ups and downs due to specific, kind of one-time economic changes or shocks. A lot of that is due to a combination of free trade deals that governments around the world have been signing with each other. And some of it is due to technical advances. You have larger and larger container ships able to move goods around very cheaply and relatively quickly. You have oil tankers and to some extent pipelines moving oil and gas and from one region to another and relatively cheaply. So all these goods are moving around over global patterns. And these same conditions have created have turned supply chains that build products into very complex networks of supply and distribution. For instance, you may have heard the story about what happens to where fish sticks come from. Well, a lot of fish sticks are caught over here in, say, the waters off Alaska. They are flash frozen and flown by airplane to China, where labor is very cheap, so you can get people to do things without paying them very much. And they are, they're chopped up in fish stick form, and then they're refrozen and flown back on a plane to the U.S., where we go to McDonald's and eat them. So very complex, and without modern technologies and modern trade deals, totally not going to happen. And so a lot of goods, more complex than, say, fish sticks, have parts coming from many, many countries. If you were to look at your average car and try to figure out where it actually came from, well, you'd probably be talking, like tires from Mexico, design from the U.S. and Germany and Japan, engines from, who knows, Brazil, Italy, take your pick, and all coming together somewhere and then assembled and put on a boat on a container ship and shipped right to you. With the environment, in some ways good ways and more often bad ways, the environment has also been affected by globalization due to long-standing wind patterns and that kind of thing. Pollution, which has increased as the economy has grown in a lot of places, travels the world. For instance, a lot of the smog in California actually doesn't come from factories in California. It comes from factories in eastern China, which, the smog, the smoke and pollution kind of rises up from the factories, goes all the way over the Pacific Ocean, and comes down around California. Pollution from American factories in the Northeast has done similar things to Canada and falls as acid rain, or at least used to more in the past, before acid rain was more, or the factors that led to acid rain were more regulated. And so the U.S. or the world really is is becoming kind of integrated with one region with the other. Overfishing is another good example. You have countries now able to send out long distance fleets to fish pretty much any waters in the world, and the technology is such that, as you can see, there's like a giant net they've got here that it can pick up and devastate the populations of fish in any given area, and that causes a lot of problems. The fishermen who had been previously working that area, say one example is off the coast of Somalia, now there are no fish, so what are they going to do? Well, they're going to turn to piracy because that's the next best option. And so you have, say European ships grabbing up all the fish in the waters off Somalia, heading back, selling that in Europe. And then the next time the fishermen go there, the Somali fishermen have turned into pirates and take the European fishermen hostage, and then the Europeans pay ransom, and so on back and forth. So it's kind of like a set of dominoes, the way that these interactions are around the world are becoming kind of more and more intense. In terms of plants and animals, there are certain types of species that move from one region to the other, or are moved by humans from one region to another. You can think most prominently around here of kudzu, which was originally brought in from Japan in order to stop erosion in South Carolina, but now has kind of taken over the side of the road. If you drive down the highway anywhere, you just see a big blanket of greenness. You can think of Burmese pythons in Florida, which I think this might be a Burmese python. I'm not really sure. I just Googled Burmese python versus alligator, and this is what popped up. So theoretically, this is an example of a Burmese python, but even if it's not, in Florida these days, you have pythons which have been brought over as pets from Southeast Asia, and people get tired of them, they get big, all of a sudden they're released into the Everglades, the swampy area in Florida, and they have no natural predators and nothing to stop them from spreading and dominating the habitat, and that's what's called an invasive species. A species that's able to invade a new area because the area isn't used to it, and all of this has been helped by increased trade between different regions of the world, increased travel of humans quite a bit. In response to this, you've got the countries of the world coming together. Here's the United Nations building in New York. The countries of the world coming together to try to hammer out some solutions to some of these problems. So I guess it's interesting you see that the problems are globalized, all kind of caused by contributions from many countries. And so people are coming around to the idea that the solutions also have to be globalized. Like say you have an international treaty on fishing, and in order to stop people from overfishing certain areas that everyone can agree on. You might have an international agreement on the release of carbon as a pollutant into the atmosphere that could help keep carbon levels in the atmosphere below the level that will really cause drastic climate change. So it's keep your eyes on this. It's an interesting potential to improve what's going on with globalization. But that is it for this lecture, and I'll see you in class.